Most people think that if you want to obtain US residency, you have to get something called an EB-5 visa, more commonly known as a green card. But that's actually not true. There's a different path that not many people talk about that gives you US residency, gives you the ability to stay there indefinitely, and is a fraction of the cost of the EB-5 visa. It's called the E-2 visa, and in this video, I'm going to walk you through step by step exactly how to obtain one. All the way down to the forms you have to submit, the exact timelines, and how to veritably guarantee your approval. My name is Ian, and I'm one of the lead consultants here at the Avia Group, and for the past year or so, our team has helped tons and tons of investors and entrepreneurs immigrate into the States on an E-2 visa. Now, for those of you who don't already know and want to understand what the E-2 actually is, according to the US Consulate, the E-2 is a non-immigrant classification that allows a national of a treaty country to be admitted to the United States when investing a substantial amount of capital in a US business. Now, notice how it says treaty country. What that actually means is that the United States has to have an E-2 treaty with the country you are a citizen of. This includes most first world countries like Canada, the United Kingdom, Mexico, Ireland, Germany, Poland, the list goes on. Now, notice how it says substantial amount of capital. Notice how there's no number next to that. Generally, what we've seen to veritably guarantee your case is that you have to invest at least $80,000 to $100,000 into a US-based business. Now, keep in mind that if you want to start a huge company or start a hospital and you only invest $100,000, you are going to get denied. The reason for that is because the substantial amount has to be relative to the amount it costs to actually start up the business. So let's say you're starting up a small business or you're acquiring one, let's say a convenience store, a gas station, a clothing store. That's generally going to work if you invest $100,000. As you can see here on the USCIS website, a substantial amount of capital is substantial in relationship to the total cost of either purchasing an established enterprise or establishing a new one. It also goes on to say a bona fide enterprise refers to a real, active, and operating commercial or entrepreneurial undertaking which produces services or goods for profit. Now that brings me to my point about who this is actually for. This is for serious investors and entrepreneurs from foreign countries that want to immigrate into the United States that are ready to deploy at least $100,000 into a US-based business and are willing and wanting to actively operate. What that means is no passive real estate, no vending machine business. Your involvement has to be active as an owner. Now, this E-2 lasts for 5 years for yourself, your spouse, and any kids under 21. And what I meant by indefinite at the beginning of the video is that you can renew your E-2 for as long as you're running the investment came in on. And the best thing about this is that you don't have to wait a year, 2, 3 years, depending on your country for the green card. Generally, the E-2 processing time's anywhere from 3 to 6 months. It's August right now at the time of this recording. If you submitted your E-2 application right now, you generally get a decision anywhere from beginning of December to February. Before I break that down, check your treaty nationality, ensure it's E-2 eligible, make sure you're going to be active in the business that you're investing in, and ensure your funds are lawful and traceable. Now, you can either go about this by starting a new business or acquiring an existing one. They're very different in nature, but ultimately lead to the same outcome, which is getting an E-2 visa. Setting up a business is a little more difficult because it requires a little more legwork with the business plan and all of the invoices and costs you have to track within the process. That includes a lease, any startup costs with the business, employees you're hiring, etc. With acquiring an existing business, it's pretty easy to show your substantial investment. You have to take the funds from your account into an escrow and ultimately into the seller's account, and that's your at-risk investment. So for the setup, there's just a lot more legwork involved that you have to track expenses, receipts, invoices for the at-risk amount that ultimately add up to that $100K minimum. When it comes to acquiring an existing one though, as I said, it's just one transfer and you're good to go. So step 1, make sure your source of funds are coming from the right place. And that $100K has to come from a legitimate source. So drug dealers, gun smugglers, sorry, you're out. All the USCIS really cares about is where those funds came from and how it was moved into the proper channels. So just make sure you're creating a proper money trail from where the funds actually originated, whether it be from a sale of a house, income of a business, ultimately into the account that's being used for the at-risk funds. This can also come in the form of a gift. So if Santa Claus or one of your family members decides to actually pay for the at-risk amount, just make sure that's transferred into your account and ultimately into the account of a seller or the business that you're setting up. Now, step 2 is choosing the right business. I'm going to assume you're acquiring a business as opposed to setting one up. The only real difference is that you have to set up the LLCs, the bank accounts, etc. when you're actually setting one up, and obviously tracking all those invoices and expenses going toward that hours amount. Now, as cliche as it sounds, we honestly look on places like Biz Buy Sell for really good businesses that ultimately will get our clients into the States very easily. I'll tell you what we look for generally from an eligibility perspective, but also a financial perspective. So the first thing we're actually looking for is something called a PE ratio. That means price to earnings ratio. We're generally looking for anywhere from a 2.5, 2x and under. I'll give you an example. So if a business is listed for $250,000 and their cash flow is $100,000, that PE ratio is going to be 2.5x. Ideally, we like to see 1-to-1, meaning a business is listed for $200,000, cash flow is $200,000. That's something we really like as well. But generally, anything under 2.5x, the payback period is going to be pretty quick. So you'll make your initial investment into the business back within around a year. Now, one other thing that the USCIS likes to see is 1 to 2 as US employees within a business. So what we look for is at least that number. It can be part-time or full-time. The third piece of criteria is operation and transfer. So the seller is willing to train the owner once they come on board to ultimately show them the ropes, show them how the business works, whether it's a convenience store, a bike shop, a juice bar, a restaurant, you name it. Now, once you reach out to this business, they're generally going to give you something called the CIM. That's a confidential information memorandum. What that is basically a summary of the business. It's generally going to reveal the location. Sometimes it'll reveal tax returns, balance sheets, anything you need to ultimately take the next step with the seller. If the business is being listed by a brokerage, that's generally industry standard practice, but if it's being listed by an individual, you want to ask for that as well. So let's say you jump on a call with the seller or the broker and you like what you see so far. You can send them something called a non-binding LOI or non-binding letter of intent. This is an informal offer to the seller or the brokerage, basically raising your hand to say, I'm interested in this. I'd like some more documentation. Now, when you send a non-binding LOI, two things will generally happen. Number one is the seller will just send you all the documentation that you need to do your due diligence. This is ultimately going to include bank statements, tax returns, payroll, lease agreements, all the customer connections, seasonality, transition plans, you name it. Now, the other outcome is that the broker or seller will generally send you a purchase agreement that will give you the ability to enter the due diligence period. Note that this is still non-binding, so if you choose to back out within the due diligence phase, you still can. Make sure in that purchase agreement, it gives you that ability to back out. Otherwise, you're jumping into a business that you haven't done the due diligence for. At that point, after it's signed, then you now have the ability to go through all the documentation. You can do this yourself or you can hire a lawyer to do it. Now, how we like to generally structure this when it comes to a finalized purchase agreement post due diligence is that we like to put a clause in the purchase agreement that basically places funds in escrow until the E-2 is approved. What this basically means in plain English is that the purchase of the business is contingent on E-2 approval. So in the case that it's not denied, the agreement is void. If it is approved, then the funds will be released from escrow. So let's say now you've structured your funds, you've gone into a purchase agreement, and the funds are now in escrow. What's the next step? As long as the seller's transferring everything, so the LLC and the bank accounts, and it's not just an asset sale, you can start work on the business plan. If it is just an asset sale, you want to make sure you're setting up an LLC, you're getting an EIN number, and you're setting up bank accounts for the business. Now, generally, a business plan for the E-2 is at least 20 to 25 pages long. In some cases, it can go up to 40, but there are some key elements you have to understand when writing this plan. The more simple the business, the shorter the plan, the more complex the business, the longer the plan. But generally, the breakdown for each section of the business plan goes as follows. Number one is the executive summary. So that's a big picture overview of the business and its goals. Number two is the investment breakdown. So the amount you're actually going to be investing, where that money is coming from, where it's going. Number three is the business model. So that's going to be ultimately what you sell, who your customers are, and how you make money. Number four is market research. So you have to basically prove in that section that what you're selling, whether it's a product or service, is in demand in that particular market. Number five is the job creation plan. So how and when you're going to hire US workers. If you follow the structure I just outlined, you won't need to include much there because ultimately, if the business comes with its employees, you're all set. So the next thing is a financial projection. So because this is a 5-year visa, you want to make a 5-year financial plan year to year of how you think the business is going to go in terms of its growth. You want forecasts and models ideally showing expected revenue, profit, and growth. Number 7 is the owner's role. So your role in the business. What are you going to be doing day to day? We'd like to see a day in the life of what your responsibilities and roles are going to be within said company. This shows the USCIS that you're going to be involved in the business. Number 8 are any qualifications that you have as the owner. So let's say you have a construction business in Canada and you want to set up a construction business in the States or buy an existing one, right? You want to show any licenses, anything that's relevant to your role that you're going to be undertaking in the United States. The last thing you need to include are the appendices. So any models, visuals, charts, resumes that you feel you need to include to ultimately get you and your family to the States. Now, once you put the funds in escrow and you've written a business plan, now it's time for a legal prep. We generally advise you to hire an immigration lawyer to handle this matter, but if you want to do it yourself, I'll break it down here. Now, I'm going to break down all of the required forms you're going to need and everything you need to do to submit this package to the U.S. consulate. You need the DS-160, so that's the online non-immigrant visa application. You need your DS-156E, that's for the investor visa, the E-2. If you are represented by an attorney, you need a G-28 form. If not, you won't need this. You need a cover letter basically explaining your business and how the investment meets E-2 requirements. You're going to be breaking this down at the interview with the consulate. You obviously need your business plan that I spoke about, the money trail, so proof of funds, where it's coming from, where it's going, all of the purchase documents, so the LOI I mentioned, the asset purchase agreement, proof of the funds being in escrow, all the business financials, so the P&Ls, the balance sheets that I spoke about before acquiring the business that you're going to need, and then ownership evidence, so the LLC operating agreement, all the stock certificates, the EIN number, and then any personal info, so your passport, you need your resume, any prior visas that you've had. The more documents you can ultimately provide, the better. Now, there are two options here. Number one is you can apply for a change of status if you are already in the United States. I generally would not recommend that for a few reasons. I can break that down in another video, but the other option is ultimately to apply at a U.S. consulate abroad. So you're going to submit this packet to the U.S. embassy or consulate in your home country. Now, for the processing fee at the U.S. consulate, you're generally looking at around $300. In terms of the timeline, there's generally 3 steps the consulate has to take. You have document review, interview wait, and the time it takes to issue your visa after it's approved. When the U.S. consulate in your country reviews your documents, you're generally looking at 1 to 4 weeks, depending on the consulate. What we've seen in the bigger countries for interview wait is around 2-ish months, depending on the country you're in. It can be shorter, it can be longer. Unfortunately, the USCIS doesn't release official wait times for the E-2. It's just generally based off of past cases. Now, after your interview date is set and you go to the interview, you're going to be asked some questions regarding the business. You're going to come prepared with your packet that I just went over. Once they approve you, the issuance of the visa that you've just been granted is generally going to take 2 to 10 days. After that visa is issued, the funds will now be released from escrow and you are free to go into the United States on your E-2 visa. Now that you've been approved, it's time for you to get your family, if you have a family, into the States on the E-2 visa. Again, we recommend your spouse and your children to apply at your home consulate, not in the States, so that they can get the E-2 visa as opposed to just the status. So your spouse and your children will each need to submit a DS-160. That's the online visa application, 1 application per family member. Make sure they all have their passports. They submit those. You need to submit your marriage certificate for your spouse. If the language is not English, make sure you translate it and certify that marriage certificate into English. And the same goes for birth certificates. Now, in terms of proof of a relationship with their spouse outside of just marital status, they like to see photos together, joint bank accounts, etc. And most importantly, make sure you as the individual, make sure you bring along a copy and submit a copy of your own E-2 approval. Now, the visa fee, depending on the consulate, is generally going to vary, but we've seen it's around $300. So if it's a family of 4, you as the individual, a spouse, and kids, you're looking at $1,200 in processing fees. Now, the timeline on this is pretty quick. Your spouse needs to go into the appointment. If you have kids under 14, they generally do not need to come with your spouse. If they're older, they do. Turnaround time on this is a few weeks. It can vary depending on the consulate though. Now, most legal firms stop here when it comes to your E-2 approval because their job is done. They're not going to be coaching you on the business, giving you insight on how to run it. That's really your job. But I want to make sure you are prepared when it comes to managing your investment because that's why you're there in the first place. Because if your investment tanks, then so does your visa, so does your residency, and now you're going back to your home country. Now, different people are going to be starting different types of businesses, especially if you're a first-time business owner. There are some key things that you need to know. As soon as you get into the States, make sure all bank accounts are open, payroll is set up, any onboarding for new employees, make sure you have all your vendor logins. Now, after day 30, you're starting to get settled in, you're a little more familiar with the process. Here, you might want to be making some more hires, getting a better understanding of the financial situation, maybe make some more financial projections for the month, the quarter. Now, at day 60, generally, this is where I would start looking at SOPs, building out standard operating procedures for your employees so that you don't have to be there to manage them or baby them 24/7. You can also look at hiring a manager so you can work less hours in the week. Yes, you need to be actively managing your investment, but you obviously don't want to be a slave to your business. And by day 90, you should be working 6 to 10 hours a week with minimal stress, with an active investment. Your kids are in school, your wife has a job, and you're starting to really live the American dream. And that's it. A to Z, that's exactly how you can get you and your family into the States on the E-2 visa. Now, if this helped, I put everything into one document for you. It's called the 2025 E-2 Visa Blueprint. It has checklists, red flag scorecards, interview prep, all the deal breakdowns, everything you really need. You can find it in the link down below.